Here we go. Good evening. My name is Katie Rudder. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the Rourke Art Museum. I am so happy to welcome you to the latest iteration of our Rourke Art and Design Lecture Series, and we're so happy to welcome Kylie Linh Hoang here tonight. Kylie Linh Hoang is a curator and public historian who believes a deep understanding of our past can lead us forward to a more vibrant future. She also believes that museums are some of the most visceral places where history can be learned, and that they have the unique opportunity to promote social equity and restorative justice through exhibitions and programming. Kylie centers accessibility, accountability, and anti-colonial strategies in her museum work to create opportunities to engage that are meaningful and culturally relevant. She is currently an assistant curator at the Minnesota Museum of American Art, and tonight she'll be presenting Beyond the Blackbook, Minnesota Graffiti Culture and Influence. Would you help me give her a very warm welcome to our stage? Hi.
Hi.
Thank you guys so much for braving the weather to come out and listen to me talk. Thank you also to Katie Rudder and the whole Rourke team for inviting me out here. I'm really excited, and this is some pretty new research that I'm working on. So I also want to give a couple other thanks to my team and the artists. I'm deeply indebted to Laura Joseph and my team at the M for support. If you haven't come down to St. Paul to see us, please do. We're downtown on 4th and Robert Street, and we're opening a new show on July 11th. I'd love to see you there. Most importantly, I would like to thank the Lynn Lake Street Art Series team, Joe Ellis, and all of the artists from Paintings, including Peyton, George, and SHOCK, who were consulted for this lecture, but also Aaron Nye, Rhyme, Shaka Mcauley, and Wes Winship for sharing their time and talent with me. So, you're all here because you have some interest in graffiti, right? Yes? Yes? Okay. Can anyone remember the first time you saw graffiti? No. You were 12? Tell me about it. Tell me about it. What did you see? What was special about it? What made it memorable?
I think the bubble letters.
The bubble letters. Okay. Okay.
That there was a shading and texture, and I guess I just didn't understand how I did that from like that height.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Cool.
The scale.
The scale and the style, it sounds like, is what you reacted to. Anybody else?
What I remember from way back when is the idea of vandalism.
Okay. The idea of vandalism. Tell me more about that.
Well, this was probably maybe, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. I don't recall, but I was not living in the United States.
Okay.
But seeing it and having people comment on it as vandalism, it would be in public places, on trains, for instance, buses.
Yeah.
And so there was a subterfuge, and the commentary everywhere was about vandalism.
Okay, interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of graffiti artists do sometimes call themselves vandals as well, but I would encourage you all to think of graffiti as something additive, something that benefits the landscape. It doesn't change the structural integrity of a building. It doesn't impact the usability of a train. It's something that adds visual interest and gives you something to focus on while you're on the train or while you're walking around the city. But that's a viewpoint that has persisted, and it's something I'm excited to talk with you about today. I think it's important. Does anybody else have a graffiti story that they would like to share with me? Anybody else have like a favorite piece in the cities that every time they walk by it, they're excited or they stop and they give it a moment? Yeah.
It wasn't visually impressive, but there had been this blank billboard in downtown Fargo back in the 90s that just remained that way for a long time. And someone saw an opportunity.
Right.
And so they spray painted the phrase, "Enjoy work, robots."
Did that resonate with you?
It did.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that.
I think it's only appropriate to also talk about, there we go, where I first started looking at graffiti. So I grew up in Portland, Oregon, which is now considered a major graph city, but I had never really spent time looking at it or thinking about it until I moved to the Twin Cities in the summer of 2020. I took a part-time job at the Walker Art Center, and I didn't have a car, I didn't know how to drive, so I was walking there every day, and I passed this overpass on I-94. And these were taken throughout my tenure at the Walker. You can see I didn't work there for very long. But at the very top there, you'll see X Gon Give It To You, and DMX, the rapper, had recently died. And so you're seeing this like bland and uninspiring retaining wall that otherwise wouldn't have anything on it, used as a memorial site. In April of that same year, a local graffiti writer died, and this was just one of many pieces dedicated to him that I saw throughout the cities. And I remember reading an article about how beloved he was and how heartbroken the city was. And so not only are we using this retaining wall as a site for like national mourning, but also like very localized messages here. In the summer of 2021, I couldn't find a date for this one because it was a screenshot from my Instagram story, but well before October 7th of this last year, you'll see it says Free Palestine, and you might not be able to read the end there, but it says End Genocide. So again, we're going these macro and micro levels of commentary. And then down here, right around the 4th of July, you'll see that it says Can't Trust Blue. So I was walking past this multiple times a week, and I was just thinking about who is doing this? What else do they have to say? I was pretty uninitiated. I didn't know anything about the street art scene in the cities, but I knew that people had something to say and that it mattered. I began searching like the writers' names on Instagram, and I didn't know how important Instagram was in graffiti culture at that time, but I got lucky enough that some of them let me follow them, and some of them responded to my DMs. And I took this overpass, this retaining wall, and I re-envisioned it as a place for communal grief and communication and creativity. And that really sparked something in me personally. After walking by this alleyway to a job that I didn't particularly enjoy, I began walking more around the cities and picking favorite alleyways and abandoned buildings just to see more graffiti. This is where my interest in graffiti started, was with this retaining wall here. But the history of graph goes back much, much further. Now, some folks will say that graffiti has been around as long as humans have. They'll reference cave drawings or writing on the wall from Pompeii as evidence that people have had a need to publicly express themselves since the start of forever. That's definitely true, but I would also say that if we're looking at modern graffiti culture, we need to look at the 1970s and the birth of hip-hop culture in New York. It's important to understand some of the socio-historical context of the Bronx at the time. So in the early 70s, 80% of housing in the South Bronx was lost to fires. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, and the fires, coupled with declining employment rates, discriminatory bank lending, and active governmental divestment, led to increased poverty levels in primarily Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods. Grandmaster Caz, who was a member of the culture-defining performance group the Cold Crush Brothers, told PBS, "Hip-hop created a musical landscape in the 70s and early 80s by giving New York, or the Bronx, especially the Bronx, a musical foundation or a new start, because we were just coming off the 60s where the entire city was bankrupt and the environment gave birth to hip-hop." Alan Kett, who is an artist, graffiti historian, and co-founder of the Museum of Graffiti, affirms this perspective and wrote that graffiti specifically was a form of self-expression and a creative escape in decaying neighborhoods and underfunded school systems that offered little hope for urban youth. So this is where we're really starting to see graffiti take hold in New York City. And now that we know more about the origins of hip hop, I think we can talk about what exactly it is. So a lot of people will say that there are up to 9 elements of hip hop, but these are really the core pillars that come up again and again, as defined by Africa Bambaataa. So the first pillar, DJing, is an auditory talent to handle beats and music in an artistic way. Rhyme saying is also known as emceeing or rapping, is the oral art of speaking poetry over a beat. Breaking or breakdancing is the art of physical movement and the ability to, often improvisationally, combine quick footwork and acrobatic prowess. Writing is another word used for and with graffiti. They call themselves writers because that's what they do, they write. And that is the visualization of hip hop culture. The fifth element of knowledge is the ability to pass, or the fifth element of knowledge and the ability to pass knowledge down is related to both self and community. Knowledge relies on the ethos of each one, teach one, and emphasizes mentorship and education as a cultural value. Knowledge is how the culture is shared, and it weaves all of the other elements together. It requires a social and political consciousness of Afro-diasporic principles and conditions, and relies heavily on mentorship to realize the shared goal of empowerment for all marginalized groups. You can see almost all of these elements referenced together in this photo by Joe Conzo Jr. He happened to go to school with a couple members of the Cold Crush Brothers, who became this really culture-defining performance group. And Joe took pictures of them and became a really important documenter in the birth of hip-hop. DJing, rhyme saying, and breaking all found homes in the mainstream, but graffiti writing is the only creative element of hip-hop that is actively considered a crime. Yeah. Graffiti writing is the only creative element of hip-hop that is actively considered a crime. I am painting with pretty broad strokes. We're being pretty general because we don't have all the time in the world here. But there are a couple of different ways that graffiti can be recognized. And I think it's helpful to work through some of the most distinctive elements. So these first images, I'm sorry? Oh, okay. These first images show some examples of a tag, which is usually a stylized lettering of a name that can be put up pretty quickly. These are usually done with like markers or paint pens, and they carry the least status for writers. Right here, you'll also see slaps or stickers that you can make ahead of time. They also don't carry as much status, but are a really fun example of how you can get your tag up. It's the yellow sticker up there. These next examples are throw-ups or throwies. A throwie is usually a shortened version of your tag, and you'll see a lot of them are usually about 2 letters. They're done in the bubble letters with 1 or 2 colors, and again, these don't really carry a whole lot of status, but they are important in getting up and establishing yourself as a writer in any given city. This, in my opinion, is a really great example of a piece, which is short for masterpiece. Pieces typically require some planning, and they have more complicated letter forms, fills, and backgrounds. Often, writers will plan pieces out pretty extensively in their black-bound sketchbooks, which is where we get the title for the talk. What do you all see? What do you notice? Shark?
Yeah, fish.
Movement.
Okay.
Lots of movement.
Lots of movement, yeah. So this piece is by Peyton Scott Russell, who writes Desk One. You'll see the spelling down here. We're really lucky to know that Peyton was actually the very first person to do graffiti on a large scale in the Twin Cities. I think this is a really great example of his work in terms of like the fade in the letters and the balance of the piece as well. And then you're looking at the background and the contrast between those 2 colors.
Is that fence in the foreground a real fence, or is that part of the painting?
Yeah, that's a real fence that he had to hop. So Peyton, the artist behind the last piece, and many other writers were inspired to start writing because of the film Style Wars. There were a lot of films that came out in the early 80s about graffiti and about hip-hop culture, but Style Wars was different in that it was a documentary. And it had actual graffiti writers and the vandal squads that were searching for them, not necessarily in conversation with each other, but appearing in the same documentary. The filmmakers even managed to get Scheme, who was one of the most prolific writers in the city at the time, and his mom on camera. At one point, he's describing his goal to be all city, and his mother replies, "All city? To what end?" She's kind of laughing at him and making fun of him and saying, like, why is this something that you care about? But it's very clearly something that he's willing to dedicate all of his time, all of his resources, his life to. It was this level of authenticity that inspired Peyton to go out the next day and get spray paint from a now defunct automotive store in North Minneapolis. From then, he shares, "I was different. I was changed forever." He wrote several different names before deciding on Dask, which was based on a childhood nickname from his mother. The photo here reads, "Mac and me." Speaking for himself and his own practice, graffiti isn't meant to be destructive. Black and brown communities have had enough of that, and he has so much more to say and to show you. Rather, Peyton affirms that graffiti is an essential element of hip-hop culture. So this picture is from the 90s. He would have been, I don't know, probably about 15 in this one, and you'll see him posing next to his work. Is there anything we notice here compared to his last piece? Yeah, there's not a background here.
It seems like it's almost supposed to look like electrically charged.
Yeah, there's definitely a different style happening here. That's something that I think is really cool about Peyton's career as a graffiti writer, is that his style is constantly evolving. I could show you 20 pictures from the last 40 years that he's created, and you would think it's a different person every time just because he's so inventive and innovative. Peyton is also dedicated to sharing his knowledge of graffiti tradition and form with the next generation. He received a Bush Fellowship to create the organization Sprayfinger. And Sprayfinger teaches graffiti as a fine art practice for people of all ages. He teaches graffiti as self-expression and exploration. All of the students that go through the Sprayfinger coursework will develop a tag, study letter forms, choose a name, create stencils, and they use their chosen name as a source of inspiration and creativity. I've never gone through the training myself, but from my perspective, one of the most exciting things about the way Peyton has structured the programs is access to his graffiti library. He has a huge collection of books on the topic, and it's incredible, and it spans decades. The advanced students in his program even have the opportunity to use the library to do artist studies. Peyton and Sprayfinger also organized the Gondola Project, which is going into its 5th year, I think. There's a tradition of graffiti writers organizing jams, which are events both by and for writers to get together and paint. There's also a long history between graffiti writers and freight trains as a favored canvas, and the Gondola Project marries these two essential elements of graffiti into a weekend-long event where writers are able to do top-to-bottom pieces on functioning freight trains in full support of the community. Peyton has contributed so much to my personal understanding of the culture and has been incredibly generous with his time, resources, and knowledge, all of which I am incredibly thankful for. We can't talk about Minneapolis graffiti, though, without talking about heavy metal. Heavy metal is a crew that started in the Twin Cities in the 90s, but has since evolved to include members from all over the country. Crews are really common in graffiti culture, and they create a sense of camaraderie and mentorship amongst writers. I like to think of them as artist collectives because that's really what they are. This image was taken from the heavy metal Instagram, and it features some pieces from 1997. This middle piece here is from George Thompson, or EWOK, who, among others, has been a really active participant in the Lynn Lake Street Art series. This is a piece he did last summer as a part of the series, and I think it shows a lot of his strengths as a writer in terms of composition, balance, color, and technical skill. So I'm going to ask you all again, what do you see? A lot of depth, okay. Yeah, George is really well known for his skill in rendering. So there are some works that are like very 3D, very reminiscent anime even, and like the multiplicity of textures that show up there.
So what's on the right in red and blue, is that part of this, or is that another?
It's another piece,
Okay.
yeah. I actually have a photo of that one later on too, so don't worry, you'll see it. So Heavy Metal as a crew is still very active, and its members are all doing really amazing things. But I want to focus on the 90s in particular, because that's when EWOK and Heavy Metal were really establishing themselves in the broader graffiti scene. And these graffiti jams, the painting festivals, are becoming a lot more common. There was Paint Louis in St. Louis and Scribble Jam in Cincinnati. And they both offered opportunities for EWOK and other Twin Cities writers to flex their creative abilities and showcase the talent that the area had to offer. Assisting in this endeavor was Thompson's part-time job at FedEx Kinko's, where he and his friends had unlimited access to color copy machines. And what started as kind of going to your friend's place of work and annoying them turned into what a lot of people call the holy grail of Midwest graffiti. It was a magazine made by writers for writers, and they called it Life Sucks Die. The issues were inconsistent in timing, but full of color images of local burners and interviews with rising stars from the hip-hop community. Notably, the team was able to secure interviews with underground rapper MF Doom and LP of Run the Jewels. They also contained less tasteful elements, including rankings of the group's daily poops, selections from porn, and photos of roadkill. But Life Sucks Die offered a group of really passionate writers a platform to center Minneapolis and the Twin Cities broadly as a place where graffiti culture was alive and thriving, as opposed to a place that just replicated what was happening on the coasts. This image is a scan from one of the editions, and you can see how committed the group was to documenting the local scene. It was the most safe for work image I could find. SHOCK grew up in the Twin Cities while DASC and EWOK were actively writing. Peyton Scott Russell, that first writer we talked about, was actually one of his art teachers. And Peyton remembers 12-year-old SHOCK coming up and insisting on going out to paint graffiti. And Peyton never took him, but he went out on his own and became one of the most prolific graffiti writers the cities had ever seen. His work is layered, and it's meticulous and multicolored. His love of science fiction is really apparent in all of the work that he does, and he often has technological elements that thread through his work and push your eyes through it, reminiscent of like wires hidden behind walls. His style of graffiti questions what lies beneath the surface in terms of both the literal wall and his applications of paint, but also the layered history of places. I think you know what's coming. What do you see?
See the bricks behind the paint.
Yeah. Yeah.
This one looks like it's almost tilted this way.
Yeah, his perspective on this one is really interesting.
I think without the framing of the top half,
Mm-hmm.
that's part and parcel of it.
Yeah.
Without that top half, the bottom half might not make as much sense.
Yeah. What do you think of the colors he's using?
He's matching it to like the building, like the red on the windows is the same as it, and like it's going off the bottom part into it, so it's like the same piece now.
Yeah, one thing that's really important to SHOCK is where he's painting. He's told me that he thinks what makes graffiti cool is where you do it. And so you'll see that he really takes notice of the places that he's painting and does his best to honor them in the work that he creates.
Are there a lot of people in that piece holding telephones?
Do you see a lot of people in that
I
piece?
see
Yeah?
people holding telephones, yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I'm talking about. His work is really layered. The more time you spend with it, the more you see in it. I wish I had put other images in here, but I think this is the main piece one I have for him. But he likes to hide people in his work sometimes. So after spending ample time painting in abandoned buildings, SHOCK became increasingly aware of how much is left behind when companies and corporations cease operations. At one point, Minneapolis was known as the flour milling capital of the world, and the legacy of those companies is stamped on our skyline in neon lights. Some of their factories have been turned into apartment buildings or historic sites, but there are still numerous derelict mills awaiting demolition scattered throughout the region. At a former Pillsbury mill in Springfield, Illinois, SHOCK and his frequent collaborator Static were confronted by building owners. The two had returned multiple times to paint, and building representatives were really familiar with their work just from previous encounters. They had never met the artists, but they had seen their paintings and felt that they were still wet. The owners were really interested in honoring the history of the site and invited both SHOCK and Status to stay for a 6-month residency. The result was an entirely unprecedented, immersive, 2-part exhibition featuring new paintings and sculpture. They called it Factory Sunset, and this is an installation shot from SHOCK's Instagram here. Although previously his work was often removed from the physical place it was created, so he was taking like blueprints or lighting fixtures that he found and creating 3D sculptural pieces. This body of work has been treated as an installation, and a lot of it remains in the factory itself. He's reinterpreting the material while remaining in the physical space and inviting contemplation on our ability to reinterpret the site broadly and all of the possibilities that these vacant lots can hold. I can't emphasize enough like how unprecedented this is, how uncommon it is, and how cool it's been to watch it all unfold over Instagram. Typically, building owners do not have the best relationships with graffiti writers, but the way that these folks were able to see the vision and see the beauty of what they were doing is really inspiring. I'm really hopeful I'm going to be able to make it out to Springfield this summer to see it in person. We're coming up on the end of what I have prepared for you. So I'll conclude with some thoughts that SHOCK shared with me over the phone recently. My experience with Minnesota graffiti writers has shown me that this is an art form born out of necessity and with a desire to center the local as both the artist and the viewer. It encourages a radical subversion of capitalist understandings of value and thrives off of disrupting the status quo, but it also connects those who feel unseen in their own neighborhoods. It is additive, inspiring, and meaningful, and I think worth paying attention to. Thanks. I think we have time for questions. I tried to time it so we had time for questions, but I also have my email up there, so if there's anything that comes to you later, please, I'd love to talk about graffiti. I would welcome any messages. Yeah.
Well, not knowing much about graffiti, how often do they put up a piece like that and then it gets painted over or removed?
Yeah.
You know, is it basically they do it to put it up, take the picture, because they don't know what's going to happen next?
Mm-hmm.
Or
I think that's a really interesting question. So what you're talking about is buffing. When city officials or building owners paint over something, they call it buffing. And it's not really about the end product in my experience. Like, of course you want to create something that is stylistic and interesting and impressive, but it's more about the self-exploration that happens while you're creating it. And so, of course, they're taking photos of these things. In the 90s, when they were taking film photos, they used to mail them to their friends across the country, just to show everybody like what they were doing. But it's more about like the personal reflective element, from what I understand.
okay,
Yeah.
that said, personal element and with tagging, I mean, do a lot of graffiti artists kind of use that as a way of marking their turf? You know, like this is my place and that's why I made this piece this big, kind of, or
I think that's an interesting interpretation. In my experience, it's been more like, this is my neighborhood, I live here, I've been here, and it matters that I was here. It's not necessarily about like, I own this place. It's a reflection of, I'm here and I belong, and it matters that I'm here. Yeah.
I'm just interested in your two terms, painting and writing.
Yeah.
So, how is graffiti painting? Is it writing? Is it both? I mean, what does that mean if it's both?
I do think it's both. I think graffiti writers have called themselves writers since graffiti has existed, right? And I think that's because of the particular focus on letter forms, and it taking inspiration from your own name that you've given yourself. And so I think that's where writing comes from, but you are painting, right? Most of the time you're using aerosol paint, you're using spray paint. And I think that's a really interesting distinction that you're picking up on. Yeah, did I answer that?
Yeah, I think so. You know, when I was listening, and at first I was very surprised when you used the term writing graffiti.
Mm-hmm.
And then at one point you said they were going to paint.
Mm-hmm.
So that made me think about what's involved.
Yeah.
What kind of activity it is.
Are there female graffiti artists that you have spoken to? Because I think most of the ones you've mentioned are male.
Yeah.
And how welcoming is the environment to female graffiti artists?
As long as there's been graffiti, there have been women graffiti writers. I know of a few personally, but for many reasons, maybe some of them are pretty obvious, they're a little bit less willing to talk to me in terms of like research projects. Like they're all very wonderful and welcoming people, but they're a little bit more protective with their identity. They're a little bit more protective with their practice, and that's understandable.
That would be because
I don't want to speak for them, but I would assume like their own physical safety. There are a number of really amazing female graffiti writers that come from the Twin Cities. Shiva comes top of mind for me, but none of whom I know closely, and none of whom who have been willing to. I mean, I haven't really asked all of, but
because you mentioned earlier on a couple of times that they are also aiming for status, which you only derive from sort of within a group. So how is that? That might be different for women then?
Yeah, and I think that there's more work to be done in this realm of female graffiti writers. There are a couple of books, but they mostly focus on all-female crews, and none of those are coming out of the Midwest, at least as far as I've seen. And so I think there's more work to be done. And I also think that there's some interesting things happening with language too. I think a lot of women who paint in this way don't call themselves graffiti writers. Sometimes they'll call themselves muralists or street artists. But I don't know. There's more work to be done there, definitely. Yeah.
What did you see in that opposition, muralist versus graffiti writer?
I think that there's a certain stigma that comes with the word graffiti, regardless of what the actual output is. But I do think I would need to talk to more female graffiti writers or street artists or muralists to understand why they're making that active choice to call themselves something different.
You mentioned that it's mostly all spray paint. Is that exclusive? What other formats with it?
So that's really interesting. A previous iteration of this talk compared the multiplicity of ways that these three particular writers are creating in this moment. So we can talk about like SHOCK. He's not only doing like large-scale murals on walls, he's also doing t-shirts, he's also doing functional lamps, he's also doing collage work with plywood and schematics and things that are found in these abandoned buildings. I think it's more about an attitude and a mindset as opposed to the actual physicality or materiality of the work.
Do you know anything about, like, listen to like the actual like seen, like as far as like there's middle of the night? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Do they have like a, do they have to like lay out a plan? Are they sleeping and
Well,
location? I don't know.
yeah, I mean, there's,
No, he said that I'm just imagining a bunch of people in the ditch waiting for the train. And then getting up there and doing it in like 2 minutes and then walking away, you know?
Well, I mean, there's just so much more that goes into it than just
Yeah.
a muralist who can show up during the daytime and, you know, do this.
yeah, it's funny you say that. In my last conversation with Shock, he was telling me that even though he has permission to be painting in this spot, he's still going in the middle of the night just because that's what feels natural and that's what feels normal to him. There is an intensive, there's an intensive amount of planning that goes into these things. The Blackbook is really where you sketch things out, where you pick your colors, where you maybe even show other people in your crew like what you're planning on doing, and you get feedback for that. As far as freight trains go, for the most part, they have schedules memorized, so they know when they're going to be in the depots or the depots. They're not painting like trains that are moving, as far as I know. Usually they're going to the train yards and painting them while they're, for lack of a better word, resting overnight. Yeah.
So where do the artists and the writers come from? Or, you know, you said that they, at one point you said that they might think, this is, I'm from this neighborhood or whatever, and this is me doing something positive for it. So, are they all from the inner city, or is there some kid from Medina that was influenced
Probably.
when he spray paints in Medina, or comes into town to do it? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately graph is about connection and it's about community. So the more that you go out and paint, the more that you're going to meet other people that go out and paint. And it's not uncommon for folks to paint in neighborhoods that aren't necessarily the ones that they live in. All three of the writers that I've talked about here have been invited to other cities around the US and internationally. Peyton's painted in Jerusalem. They're coming... Where they come from is an interesting question. They're coming from a place of inspiration, I guess, of wanting to see themselves represented in the places that they live and the places that they've been. Like I said, Shock has talked about what makes it cool is where you're doing it. So if you're in a new place and you're meeting new writers, it's cool to be painting with them.
Do you have a sense of kind of the Minnesota like numbers that we're looking at? Just like thinking in terms of scale of like how many, and of course it's going to be approximation, maybe like of how many artists we're thinking about, how many crews, is this like, you know,
I have no idea.
Hundreds,
No idea. I don't think that there's really any way that you could even try to measure that, because there are folks that like maybe go out and paint one time and decide it's not for them, and then there are people like Shock who are incredibly prolific. It's hard to know, especially because folks do change their tag pretty often. Maybe less so now because it is about like being recognized. But I think Peyton had 4 or 5 names before he settled on Dask. So yeah, I don't know the numbers. I know in the 90s it was probably about 20 active writers, and the scene has only grown from there.
So how do you feel? Do you have any insight into like feelings of, you know, because this started from, you know, a place of like, I want to be seen, like marginalized communities, you know, to the way it is now, like where, like me in Fargo, we have a graffiti alley, where anybody can go and do it. I mean, is that like a positive thing? Does it feel like appropriate to them? Like, what is the general feeling about today's views and the way we're doing it, you know?
That kind of depends on who you ask, which I know is a total non-answer, but each writer has their own reasoning for why they're doing what they're doing, and each one of them has their own sort of parameters of what makes graffiti graffiti. There are many that say if you're not stealing the things that you're writing with, you're not a graffiti writer. Like if you're paying for the paint, it's not graffiti. I think from the perspective of the writers that I know, and the way that I understand the culture as somebody who is not a graffiti writer, I would say that more graffiti is not a bad thing. Giving folks a place to do it is not a bad thing. I referenced the Lynn Lake Street Art Series a couple of times, and I was, fortunate enough to be able to work on it last summer. And that's a graffiti festival where we have permission from all of the building owners to be painting these large-scale murals. And it's amazing what these people can do with paint and time and permission. And I personally, I think that it only serves to elevate the art form even further. But I know and recognize that other people might not feel the same, and that as a non-graffiti writer, my opinion is probably not the most important one.
Are most of these pieces done beginning to end in one shot, or do people come back to finish?
For the most part, they're done all at once, I would say. I would think it's probably too much of a liability to return. We didn't focus on the criminality aspect of this really at all, because it's not really something I'm super interested in. But I do know that, like, for a long time, the Minnesota Vandal Squad was looking for Shock. And so I wouldn't think that he would return to a place after he's already painted it. But
So in the end, does this become commercialized, commodified, in a sense that a Banksy, for instance, is?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. All three of these writers sell their work. We live in a capitalist society, and they've got to pay rent. They need to eat. So all three of them are selling work. I think Shock and I have talked about this, maybe not in quite those specific of terms, but he sees graffiti as a reaction and is hopeful that someday it'll be a relic of another time, and hopefully that will evolve past a need for it.
Okay.
If that is
That helps.
okay.
When you're talking about the older generation of the graffiti, it's kind of like they wanted to be seen because they felt like they weren't being heard.
So,
and like the newer ones where they're having communities and having studios, do you think that has changed from the idea of wanting to be heard to just making an expression?
I think both can be true. I think for a lot of folks, they're still not being heard. They're still not getting the message. And when you think about graph as a response to that, as an expression of self, I think both of those things can be true and happening at the same time. So when you see things, I realize that the text on this is really small. I'm so sorry. It's a Jamel Shabazz photo of a train in New York City in 1980. And so when you see things like this compared to, larger pieces like this, I think they're both coming from the same creative source. They're both coming from the same sort of motivation to get up and to be seen as a graffiti writer.
Do you feel from the older generation to the newer generation, the newer generation has a little bit more freedom than the older ones?
I think that's also an interesting question. So now I think it's more common to have permission to paint. Graffiti festivals and jams that are sanctioned by cities or by neighborhoods are happening more often, like the one I was a part of in Uptown. And for better or for worse, I think that the material impact is that people are able to express themselves in ways that are, safe, like physically. People are able to get paid for the work that they do, and people are able to be seen by their community, and I think that those are all net gains. Cool. I think we're over time. But thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you'll look at graffiti more. Thanks.